Greetings, Nick here. I wanted to post a follow-up video to the one that I posted last week regarding changes to the Rebel Spirit Radio podcast and the YouTube channel. For the most part, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. I've gotten some really good feedback, and at the end of the week, I seem to have lost two people. I know two people unsubscribed, and that's fine. I really don't care about that. One of them sent me a message or posted somewhere, I'm not sure where it was, but I did see it, that I should have stayed in my lane. And my initial reaction was, but this is my lane. This has always been my lane. I can understand why they may think that I'm making some kind of radical departure. Like I said, my intention is not to turn this into a political podcast. It's still going to be grounded in spirituality and still going to have episodes on consciousness and psychedelics and the occasional one on the esoteric, and especially on eco-spirituality and what we can do in the face of a changing climate. But I can also understand that you don't know me that well. And that's my fault. For the most part, I'm probably just some guy who's talking to authors. And it's understandable that you don't know that much about me or what lane I've been in. So I thought I would take this opportunity to give a little bit of background about me. There are some other videos that I would like to do in this regards. I've toyed with the idea of creating a video on my own spiritual journey, and I've also thought about creating a video on my first ayahuasca experience. So those may be in the works. If people are interested, you can let me know in the comments. But I thought I would begin with my academic background. I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy from the Metropolitan State University of Denver, although when I was there it was Metro State College. And I've got a sort of unwritten minor or major even in religious studies. I took a number of religious studies courses through the University of Colorado in Denver. They are on the same campus as Metro. At the time, there wasn't a major or minor at either Metro or UCD in religious studies. UCD does have a minor in religious studies now, I believe, but at the time they didn't. Religious studies was my passion, although I do appreciate the philosophical background. The entire time that I was pursuing this degree, I worked at the University of Denver. I was a staff member. I ended up getting my master's degree in religious studies through DU. When I was done, I spent a year in a joint doctoral program between the University of Denver and the Iliff School of Theology. At the time, that was the only way that you could get a doctorate in religious studies in the state of Colorado. I was in the Religion and Social Change program that was founded by Dr. Vincent Harding, who was a close friend and colleague to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At the time, I was going to focus on religion and politics in South Asia. In 2001, while still a graduate student, I participated in a service learning program in Nepal, and it was life-changing. In 2003, the university hired me to be the site director for the program. However, it got canceled because of the political situation in Nepal. They had this, sort of pesky Maoist insurgency going on. Before that, I thought, well, this is great. I'll go to Nepal every year and do research, and it'll be awesome. But that got cut short. Then, a few months later, I lost my job. I was one of 5 people laid off in the department I worked at due to a budget crisis or bad management, maybe a combination of the both. And when that happened, I also lost my tuition waiver. This is how I ended up in California. Shortly after moving to California, I began teaching. So I've been teaching at the community college level, teaching both philosophy and religious studies for 20 years now. I did end up in a doctoral program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Technically, I was in their philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program, though I am also apparently an honorary member of their ecology, religion, and spirituality program that was started by my doctoral advisor, Elizabeth Allison. The program wasn't set up when I began. That's why I'm just an honorary member. But my heart and my work is really in alignment with the ESR program, or ERS. Excuse me, Elizabeth. I always get those confused. My dissertation was titled Greening America's Virtues. And I really wanted to take a moment to dig into that a little bit, because the main thing I want to talk about is sort of why I can say something about our current political situation and it not be me in a different lane. I was very upset, and I'm still upset by our inability as a nation to effectively address climate change. Because I had a background in philosophy, I knew that a republic, which we are, or at least we're supposed to be, is really founded in virtue. I also knew that there is a branch of environmental ethics, environmental virtue ethics, that looks at virtues in regards to addressing climate change. And my initial thought was, well, wait a minute. There's one political party at the time, the Republicans, that are constantly talking about character and virtue. And I thought, well, maybe if I could demonstrate that there is a history, a tradition of virtue in the United States, both a political tradition and a religious tradition, and then show that some of those virtues could also serve as environmental virtues, then maybe I could beat them at their game. Never go to war with the Republicans. That's the lesson I learned, because by the time I was done, they had completely jettisoned any care about virtue. But before that, I do want to talk a little bit about the American Republic and virtue. The idea of a republic, the very first political work that we really have, is Plato's Republic. Like right here. I've read this a few times. In Plato's Republic, it's an imagined form of government for him. And Plato makes a connection between the individual and the state. Now, he doesn't really use the term state. That concept comes much, 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 much later than Plato. But I'm going to use it for ease, right? So Plato thought that the individual soul was made up of parts, in fact, 3 parts. It's called the tripartite soul. And for Plato, the tripartite soul is that we have a rational part, we have a willful part, and then we have an appetitive part. It's very similar to Freud's idea of the id, ego, and superego. Makes you kind of wonder where he got the idea from. Plato took this idea of the tripart soul and made it larger, and that's the state. So the state is also made up of 3 parts. You have the rulers, which would be the philosopher king or kings, and I would also include philosopher queens in there. You have the guardians, whose job is to protect the state. And then there's the rest of us, the artisans, the agriculturalists, your basic workers, right? And there's a shared virtue between each level of the individual soul and each state of the government, right? So The philosopher king and queens need the virtue of wisdom, and our reasoning part needs the virtue of wisdom. The guardians need the virtue of courage. Our willful part needs the virtue of courage. And then the appetitive part, the workers, we need moderation. For Plato, when a government has those virtues, they will be just. And that's the end goal of government. And it should be, I think, still to this day, the end goal of any government is justice. In the individual, it's going to create a balanced individual, a whole individual. Now, Plato didn't really give us any kind of theory of virtue. That we were given by his student Aristotle. And there are two works here that I want to refer to. One is his Nicomachean Ethics, which is where he really lays out his theory of virtue, and then his Politics. Interestingly, the end of the Nicomachean Ethics is the beginning of the Politics. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but in general, for Aristotle, a virtue is a mean between two vices. There's a vice of deficit and a vice of excess. So the example, or a example, would be courage. The deficit would be cowardice. The excess would be something like a foolhardiness, where only fools rush in. The virtue is not an exact middle point between the vices. Sometimes a virtue could be closer to one of the vices. So in this instance, the courage is going to be a little bit closer probably to the sort of foolhardiness than it will be to cowardice. Virtue is something that is contextual. We have to examine the situation and think about it. And that's one of the keys, because it requires what the Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom. This is also translated as prudence. We have to think about our actions. We have to think about the situation and what the virtuous action would be. Virtue is also something that you are to make habitual. The idea here is that if you are to be a courageous person, you have to practice the virtue of courage. If you're going to be an honest person, you have to practice the virtue of honesty. It's sometimes, I think, a little bit, I don't know if paradoxical is the right word. I've been thinking about this. I've been calling it a protocol, where I get up really early every morning and spend half an hour meditating and then doing some yoga. And I have a lot of reasons for doing this, but part of it is for discipline. But it occurred to me recently, it's that, well, if I'm doing this to be disciplined, it requires discipline to even begin that. So it seems to me that there's something within us that we have the seeds of virtue, perhaps. Because if we didn't, I don't know how we could begin being virtuous. One of the things also that I think is really important is, well, why be virtuous? And for Aristotle, the answer to that question was, without virtue, you can never achieve eudaimonia. Eudaimonia means something like a good daemon, and that's probably worth a whole other video on. Traditionally, it has been translated as happiness. More often than not, especially recently, it's translated as flourishing, because it is thought that flourishing really encompasses what eudaimonia meant in a way that happiness doesn't. I also like, and this is more of a direct translation, a good spiritedness, but we'll stick with flourishing. So for Aristotle, You had to practice the virtues in order to have a flourishing life. Now, just being virtuous was no guarantee. It was necessary but not sufficient. But you could not flourish in your life without being a virtuous person. There's also the question of, well, how can virtues be taught? And the main way is through moral exemplars, by identifying moral, role models. I know in the 90s, and this is probably still a thing, many Christians would wear bracelets, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Well, asking what Jesus would do in a situation is asking, how should I do this? You're using Jesus as a role model, and you can have a lot of different kind of role models. And this is going to be important when we turn our attention to politics. Aristotle, interestingly enough, I said that each virtue is a mean between two vices. There is one exception. Aristotle did not identify an excess of justice. So according to Aristotle, you can never have too much justice. There is, of course, injustice. Aristotle defines injustice, and injustice is taking more than your fair share. Injustice is based on greed. Injustice is taking so much that other people are left in want. In his politics, the role of the polis, is probably a better term than state, is to ensure justice. Aristotle took Plato's idea of the three sort of forms of government, and what Aristotle gave us was the one, the few, and the many. I used to think that that was probably, the president, Senate, and the Congress. And I suppose you can look at it like that, but I think it's better understood as the president, the Congress, and Congress there, both houses of Congress, Congress and Senate, and then the people as the many. I think that better reflects a democratic republic. So Aristotle gave us this idea of a mixed form of government, which he kind of got from Plato. But for both of them, they recognized what was necessary was virtue. That without virtue, without virtuous politicians, without virtuous citizens, the republic could not survive. So after Aristotle, you have the Stoics, and they talk about virtue as well. We have the Roman republics, and there's a lot of reasons why the Roman republics fell. But in large part, they overextended. They took more than they needed. There was injustice. They took more than their fair share. That's one reason. And there was a lack of virtue amongst the politicians and the people. The founders of this nation understood that. They examined the ancient republics. They read Aristotle. They read Plato. They read Plutarch's Lives. Nearly every library in the colonies had a copy of Plutarch. Now, I can say this because I did my research, and that's something I want to point out. I went through and I looked at the primary writings. So I'm going to share some of those with you. I read the Federalist Papers, and I just found my copy of that, and I have misplaced it, so I can't show it, but I did read it. I went back and I read the writings of Benjamin Franklin. Interestingly, Franklin, there's a whole chapter in his autobiography on virtue. Franklin meant to write a book on it. I think he was going to call it The Art of Virtue. He never got around to it, so he incorporated it into his autobiography. Franklin was known as sort of the epitome of the self-made man. He attributed his success to virtue. And if you read this in his autobiography, he has a list of, I think, like 13 different virtues, and he kept a record. He would try to practice one of the virtues every day or every week, and he would keep a record of how well he did and where he failed and how he could improve. So he understood that for his own personal flourishing, it required virtue. There's a story of after the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution was written, of him leaving and being asked, well, what kind of government have you given us? And Franklin's response was a republic if you can keep it. And I think that at the heart of that message is it requires virtue. In fact, the revolution itself was seen as a sign of the morality, the moral superiority of Americans over the British, who at that time they saw as living in vice. I read Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, Letters from an American Farmer. This was published in 1782. These were written, I believe, right before and probably after the Revolution. But within this, lots of talk about virtue. I read Thomas Jefferson, the works of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wrote a lot about virtue. For Jefferson, it was the agrarian virtues. He believed that farming was what would provide the virtues for American citizens. Okay, and these were, various virtues like patience and independence and industry, resourcefulness, love of order, tranquility of mind, moderation, and physical and spiritual well-being. Now, I also want to mention here, in regards to both Jefferson and Franklin, that neither of them were really Christian. Sometimes there's this idea, we hear this all the time, that America was founded as a Christian nation. No, it wasn't. Jefferson famously took a scalpel to the New Testament and removed all the miracles because he thought that they were unlikely. Franklin, as a deist, he didn't care where people got their virtues. He just cared that they were virtuous, and he thought that maybe churches could teach virtue. Although he did comment that he went to a Presbyterian church and they seemed less interested in instilling virtue into the people than they were in producing more Presbyterians. Many of the founders were not Christian. And one of my sources for this, a couple of them, one is this, A Religious History of the American People by Sidney Alstrom. This is a beast, but research. Also, just as a side, America's God by Mark Knoll. Knoll's a great writer, and this is a really interesting read that talks about the role of religion in the colonies and the formation of the United States. And it's, again, this was not founded as a Christian nation. Maybe I can do a video that goes a little bit more into those sorts of details. I read, in terms of religion, a Jonathan Edwards reader. Edwards was sort of the figure in between the Puritans and the Pilgrims and evangelicalism. Edwards was also concerned with virtue. I think most people know Edwards from his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he imagines, we're like this bug, this spider hanging at the end of this very fine filament, and God's holding us over the gaping pits of hell, and it's only by the grace of God that he doesn't let go. Well, it's unfortunate that that's what Edwards is associated with, because for Edwards, at the center of creation was this loving God that was constantly pouring forth his love of creation. Edwards believed that true virtue, and he defined true virtue as benevolence to being in general. He thought that to love God's creation, to love the natural world is to love being, and that the natural world mirrored the beauty of virtue, that nature can teach us virtue. I read, this is an interesting book, pretty well known, Inventing America. This is all about the Declaration of Independence. Alexis de Tocqueville, his Democracy in America. This was in 1831. De Tocqueville, French, he's kind of considered a sociologist now, I suppose, came to the very young United States and was traveling around. And this is during the period where we were undergoing what's referred to as the Second Great Awakening. And he talked to people about things. And this is an amazing resource as well. There's also another pretty well-known book, The Enlightenment in America by Henry May. And this also demonstrates that the United States is not a product of, it's not a Christian nation. Now, this is not to say that Christianity didn't have anything to do with the founding of the nation. That's not correct. But what he demonstrates here is that the United States really is more of a product of the Enlightenment, of reason, than it is of religion. I read Theodore Roosevelt. Here's some more Roosevelt. I'm going to end with this book, but give me a little bit to get there. This is The Epic of America by James Truslow Adams. This is a narrative history of the United States. And this is the book where it is first written of the American dream. And I think it's important to look at the original source on the American dream. But again, I will get back to that. In terms of environment, I read a lot of environmental philosophy. I'm not going to show all those books, but I definitely read my Emerson, my Thoreau, writings of John Muir, and there were a few others of Muir that I wrote. And I also wanted to, I know this is a little bit overboard, but I can't help myself. I wanted to show one more thing here in terms of readings, so bear with me one moment. This is full of journal articles from peer-reviewed publications that I read for the dissertation. I mention this not to gloat or brag, but to show this is what doing your own research looks like. It's not doing a quick Google search. It's not looking at YouTube and finding someone that says something that you already agree with. It's going to the actual sources. It's going to the experts and finding out what they said. This is what doing your research is. Okay? So, anyone who thinks I'm outside of my lane, I've done my research. Now back to our story. Like I said, the Federalist Papers, those were published under a pseudonym of Publius Valerius, who was the founder of the Roman Republic. The revolution was a political and moral revolution. It was said that at the time, two ideas were dominant and on the lips of most colonists: liberty and the public good. And neither of those, liberty nor the public good, could exist without virtue. And this idea of the public good, it's often referred to as the commonweal or the commonwealth, right? It's the understanding that everyone is supposed to share in the wealth of the nation. George Washington was selected as the first president based on his perceived virtues. I think all of us have heard the story of little George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and then his dad asking him, well, did you do that? And George like, well, Father, I cannot tell a lie. Okay, that's a fabricated story. Okay, that didn't happen. But the purpose of it was to demonstrate his honesty. There were a lot of different things, ideas, character traits, virtues associated with Washington: restraint, temperance, fortitude, dignity, independence. But what he's most known for is having the strength of character to peacefully transfer power. No one else had done that before him. That took remarkable virtue. As I said, Jefferson wrote extensively on virtue. Now, I understand Jefferson and Washington and many of the founders are deeply problematic, especially Jefferson. But their ideas were what formed our nation. So it's important to look at what they said. And Jefferson was aware of a lot of his shortcomings. He feared what would happen because of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, again, honest Abe. And he encouraged us to nurture our better angels. Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a naturalist and a prolific writer. We have over 20 volumes of his published works. Again, he's problematic, but he couldn't open his mouth at a speech or put pen to paper without invoking character, without invoking the virtues. And he defined character as an assemblage of virtues. And he said that there were active and passive virtues, moral qualities. And he said that it's the moral qualities, it's the virtues, which are the measure of a nation and the measure of a citizen and the measure of a person. FDR, he invoked virtues to help us through the Great Depression and World War II. There is a tradition of virtue in this nation. All you have to do is read it. It's there. You can find it. And one of the reasons it's so important, especially in the role of the president, is the president acts as a role model. What the president does is signal to what the rest of us can do. And again, if the citizens and the politicians aren't virtuous, the republic's not going to hold. It's going to fall. So if you have someone who's acting as president that doesn't have virtue, well, it's a sad day for the republic. So, Donald Trump, I have racked my brain and I cannot identify a single virtue of that man. He's arrogant. He's ignorant. He's crass. He's vulgar. He's petty. He's a bully that appeals to the baser instincts of us. I will never understand how him mocking a disabled reporter didn't end it right then and there. He allows people to embrace the worst of themselves. The republic cannot stand this. The republic won't survive. Now, I've always said that I don't hate Donald Trump. It's hard not to. It is. But instead, what I do is I always try to turn it around on myself. In what ways am I arrogant? In what ways am I ignorant? In what ways am I a bully? In what ways am I vulgar and crass? And I use that to reflect on myself, to try to make myself a better person. I had someone once mention that Trump was loyal, and I disagree with that. I think Melania would disagree with that. The whole world knows that he was not loyal to her. He had an affair with a porn actress. He demands loyalty, but that doesn't make him loyal. You go against him, that loyalty is out the window. So, virtue is also something that is within the religious tradition. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. again. He said he longed for the day that someone wouldn't be judged for the color of the skin, but for the content of their character, their virtues. Jesus taught virtue. He was a role model. I mentioned that before. Compassion and care and love. And that's actually the glue that's supposed to hold the republic together. Not just virtue, but love. Philos. We see this in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. We're supposed to love each other, but we don't. We're divided. There's more hatred now than I've ever seen in my life. This country's sick. There's a spiritual sickness. And that spiritual sickness can only be cured if we stop and look at ourselves and how we share in it and our role in it. Now, I did say that I wanted to end with the American Dream. Again, The Epic of America by James Truslow Adams. The first book that talks about the American Dream and what it is. And there's some interesting insights in here that I wanted to share with you. And I'm going to read directly from the book that first talked about the American Dream. I can't stress that enough. So here he kind of defines the American Dream a bit. The dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for every man, with opportunity for each according to his ability or achievement. It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. And then here's what I think is most important here. And this is how he ends it. We point with pride to our national income, but the nation is only an aggregate of individual men and women. And when we turn from the single figure of total income to the incomes of individuals, we find a very marked injustice in its distribution. There is no reason why wealth, which is a social product, should not be more equitably controlled and distributed in the interest of society. But unless we settle on the values of life, we are likely to attack in a wrong direction and burn the barn to find our penny in the hay. Above and beyond the mere economic base, the need for a scale of values becomes yet greater. And then he goes on. We cannot become a great democracy by giving ourselves up as individuals to selfishness, physical comfort, and cheap amusements. The very foundation of the American dream of a better and richer life for all is that all, in varying degrees, shall be capable of wanting to share in it. It can never be wrought into a reality by cheap people or by keeping up with the Joneses. There is nothing whatever in a fortune merely in itself or in a man merely in himself. It all depends on what is made of each. Lincoln was not great because he was born in a log cabin, but because he got out of it. That is, because he rose above the poverty, ignorance, lack of ambition, shiftlessness of character, contentment with mean things, and low aims which kept so many thousands in the huts where they were born. If we are to make the dream come true, we must all work together, no longer to build bigger, but to build better. To build better. And that's what we need to do. We're surrounded by people now who focus on nothing but wealth. And I don't know how they're sharing the wealth. It's concentrated. Elon Musk, for example, on track to become the first trillionaire. And it seems to me that that's what he's more interested in, is to become the world's first trillionaire rather than using that money for good, to help. Taking more than what you need is greed. It is unjust. There's a reason Jesus was turning over the tables at the temple with money changers, you know. We need to dig in. We need to be the best versions of ourselves. And we have to change this. Because if we don't, we're not going to make it. Anyway. That's my lane. I've always been in this lane. Again, I don't want to turn this into a political podcast or anything, but and I've also seen people comment that virtue is, an antiquated idea that's really just for the wealthy or whatnot, and I think that's garbage. We have to have a moral backbone, and religion is not where that is in the sense of believing something. You can believe what you want. That doesn't make you a good person. What makes you a good person is what you do, and what you do repeatedly. Your virtues. So I'm going to leave you on that. Again, I will maybe create some other videos, maybe a little less ranty in terms of the role that religion did play in the founding of this nation, and maybe do some videos on the current threat of Christian nationalism and a few things like that. And again, I'm not going to stop the interviews that I've been doing. I'm just going to be a little bit more selective. I've got about 4 months worth of interviews in the bank. So slowly, you'll start noticing the changes. But anyway, if you stayed this long, thank you. I appreciate it. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to share this video if you want. I'd appreciate it. And if you want to show some love, there's a super like. I think you can make a donation. You can also go to the Patreon and make a donation, or use PayPal for a one-time donation. But I feel that this is a time where we can't be idle. That is not a virtue. What is needed right now is action. And hopefully it can be done in a way that honors our spirit and honors everyone else and honors the life of the planet, because that's what we have to do. And that's really what we're fighting for, is the life of the planet. So until next time, may you be at peace, may you flourish in all possible ways. Notice how I've always put that in there. And may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.